Today I'm going to try to go through, in order to explain how we need to reform economics, it's kind of important to understand how economics is currently taught. So I'm going to try to go through a bit of the problems we face, how economics is taught and fails to address those problems, and how we need to reform economics in order to do so. So starting out, so we do face, everybody here is aware that we face many, many very, very serious ecological and economic crises, and I don't need to explain global climate change as one of many. Others include this exponential population growth that Robert brought up, and biodiversity collapse. What this figure shows is actually the biomass of the human population in red and wild species in green. And the blue is our domestic animals, because we can't just think about human population growth, we have to think about how much resources we're capturing from the planet as a whole. So we see this exponential rise in human population, an even more rapid rise in our domestic animals, and an even more rapid decrease in the wild animals. So as humans grow, we're not growing into a void, we're displacing wildlife and nature. We also have to look at food price shocks and famines. So these wild fluctuations in food prices is a major problem, causing these catastrophic famines globally. So for example, you can see the spike for 2007, 2008. When that spike occurred, the price of wheat and staple grains doubled and tripled, and we saw 40 million more people enter into malnutrition because of rising food prices. So we also have this skyrocketing debt. This is a little bit out of date. It's gotten worse since then. This shows the total debt in the United States of households, corporations, financial sector, government-supported enterprise, and the government is a share of GDP. So what we've seen is debt right now is currently 3.5, almost 4 times our gross national product. The debt is growing faster than the economy. The interest rate on the debt is faster than the growth rate of the economy. So this is systematically transferring resources from the working people to the financial sector in a way that can't possibly keep going. I mean, it's exponential growth, cannot continue in any finite system indefinitely. This just can't keep going. Another major problem is soaring inequality, which is very closely related to this financial sector growth. As we transfer more and more resources to the financial sector, this is slightly out of date. The top line shows the wealth of the bottom 50% on the planet, and the red line on the bottom, the wealth of the richest 62 people. So 62 people now have as much wealth as the bottom 50%. A more up-to-date study suggests that 8 people now have the same wealth as the bottom 50%. So what we've seen is just, dramatically increasing inequality. And all of these things are driven by economic activity. They're driven by our economy, but they are ignored by mainstream economic theory. So mainstream economic theory argues that price is this fulcrum that balances supply and demand, creating a market equilibrium. And equilibrium characterizes the economy. Everything is brought into balance. All those problems I showed you before were examples of extreme equilibrium, or disequilibrium, of exponential growth, of catastrophically increasing atmospheric CO2, of catastrophically increasing populations. And so economists have this idea that we live in an equilibrium system in which the price is the single feedback loop necessary to bring that system to equilibrium. And it's all mathematized, and they have these mathematical models that show how this equilibrium occurs. Unfortunately, well, actually, a little before I get to this model also glorifies self-interest. It says that everybody acts in their own rational self-interest. We're greedy, greed is good. You look inside that magazine, and it says, yes, greed is still good. So abundant replicable studies have shown that studying economics makes people systematically more self-interested, more asocial, less likely to cooperate with others, more likely to free ride on others, less empathic. In fact, it reminds me is the exact undermining of the SEL, the social and social ethical learning. It undermines what we need in our system, and simply taking a single course in economics can make us behave more like economists say. So the markets also prioritize efficiency. And efficiency boils down to maximizing monetary value. And I talked about supply and demand intersect and reach this equilibrium. But demand in a market economy is preferences weighted by purchasing power. So we see here, I'm just showing that the preferences of those starving children weighted by their negligible purchasing power entitles them to far less food than the preference of a filthy rich Westerner weighted by an enormous purchasing power. So market efficiency allocates resources in a way that maximizes their monetary value. If you have a loaf of bread, how do you maximize its monetary value? Selling it to some destitute woman who can't possibly afford the money to feed her kids, or selling it to some very rich American who's glad to purchase that, even though most of it goes into the garbage. So in reality, I mentioned before the 2007-2008 food crisis. When the price of wheat tripled, consumption of wheat in the United States did not diminish at all. The amount we throw into the garbage did not diminish at all. We did see an increase of 40 million people becoming malnourished in less developed countries. And that was the market functioning exactly as it should, maximizing the monetary value of that wheat produced. And in general, markets allocate essential resources, the most important ones, to those who need them least, because they're allocating them to the ones with the most purchasing power. And we are calling that efficient. And economics students are taught that that is efficient. And all of us are taught that markets are efficient, and efficiency is the goal. So economics also promotes this idea of endless growth on a finite planet. It's the economy, stupid. What is economic success? It's economic growth. We need the economy not just to grow in an absolute amount, but to grow in an exponential amount. We need 3% growth regardless of the size of our economy, and we need that to go on forever. That is what the economists teach. Even though we have to understand that exponential growth within a finite system is impossible, and it always will be. And yet our goal is to continue growing exponentially forever. So that's the problems we face and the economic system we have that's uniquely ill-suited to address those problems. The question is then, how do we reform that economic system so that it can actually work? So what I have here, I'm giving many abstract ideas. I just want to put in a plug at the bottom here, this Economics for the Anthropocene. The universities of Vermont, McGill, and York University have a PhD program that applies a lot of these principles. We teach students a lot of the principles I'm going to go over. It's an ongoing program. It's very effective, but very rare. There are not many programs like this. I am talking primarily about what needs to be done, not about what is being done. Economics, I think, is one of the slowest to move disciplines. So we need to reform economics education. And the first thing is, does this really matter? Does it matter what we teach people in econ programs? You know, does this have any difference in the world? So this is a quote from John Maynard Keynes, who says, "The ideas of economists, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else." So economists do have a huge impact. Economists are probably the most influential social science there is. The only one where there's a Nobel Prize, the only one where there's a Council of Economic Advisors for the President. The huge global organizations like the IMF and World Bank are driven by economists. So economics is incredibly important, has a huge impact on how the world functions and what happens. So what do students in economics programs think about the economics programs? Every few years, there is a new manifesto, a new revolt by economic students. This is a recent one from 2014. But then here's what students say. It's not only the world economy that is in crisis. The teaching of economics is in crisis too. What is taught shapes the minds of the next generation of policymakers, and therefore shapes the societies we live in. So the students are dissatisfied with the dramatic narrowing of the curriculum that has taken place over the last couple of decades. So this is just one manifesto, but every few years there are manifestos like this at all the leading universities around the world. The one above, I think, is 46 countries, econ programs in 46 countries, students signed on to that. So students view that what they're learning is irrelevant to the problems we face in the world today. Inadequate, irrelevant, very, very theoretical. What do leading economists think? So here's Joe Stiglitz, who's a Nobel laureate from a few years ago. Economics education bears testimony to a triumph of ideology over science. I don't refer to my PhD in economics as a doctorate, I refer to it as an indoctrination program. I was taught you have to believe these things, there is no questioning this truth. It's almost as though it was revealed from on high is the truth. There's no questioning. Paul Krugman says the economics profession went astray because economists as a group mistook beauty, clad in impressive-looking mathematics, for truth. Economists are obsessed with these mathematical equations, and math is really beautiful, and you can show things to be right or wrong, and there's a right answer to every mathematical equation. Real life is not like that. We don't have right and wrong answers to our economic problems. This is from a former president of the American Economics Association, Kenneth Boulding, who says, anyone who believes exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. And that is very true. I think we need to recognize economic growth is seriously limited. So we need a change. We live in a continually evolving system. What the world is like is very different now than when it was. When economics was developed, this figure just shows the Earth is the green matter, the nature, with the economy as the brown stuff inside. When economics was developed, human populations were very small, human consumption was very small. In the last 100 years alone, I showed you before the growth in human population, quadrupling in only 100 years. Per capita consumption over that same 100 years increased 9-fold. The size of the economy has increased 36 times in the past 100 years. And what we see is we live in this world that it's finite. As the economy expands, it doesn't expand into a void, it expands into a finite ecosystem. And all the matter and all the energy used to produce economic goods and services come from nature. Some of it can be recycled, energy cannot. They return to nature as waste. We get this flux of economic service that contributes to our welfare and a flux of ecosystem services, and those ecosystem services are essential to our survival and are being pushed out by the economic system. We need to recognize that we live in this full world system where our economy cannot double again, much less increase 36 times in size as it did in the last century. So I also showed how mainstream economists view this economy as an equilibrium system, driven to equilibrium by the single feedback loop of price. The real world is an incredibly complex system. You're not supposed to understand what's going on in that complex system, but these are just a few of the feedback loops required to generate homeostasis in a human body. So one human body has all these feedback loops. Economists maintain that 7.5 billion human bodies in this complex ecosystem can be managed by a single feedback loop, and that is nonsense. Complex systems don't naturally go to equilibrium, and when they do, they require huge amounts of feedback loops, and they're continually evolving. So if we have, this is just another example of a very complex system, but if we have one of these systems, what we have to understand is you can't focus on it from the perspective of a single discipline and hope to understand things. We need a transdisciplinary perspective, which means rather than learning a discipline and applying it to any problem we face, we need to address the very serious problems we currently face and choose whatever methods and disciplines and tools are necessary to solve it. So, as they say, that I don't know who first said this, but in academia and universities, we have disciplines. In the real world, we have problems. And trying to force everything in narrow disciplinary boundaries is wildly inappropriate and impossible. So we need to have a transdisciplinary perspective, and to get a transdisciplinary perspective, you focus on a problem. You allow that problem to determine what tools are necessary, and it forces you to open your mind to other perspectives, other views, other understandings. So we really do need to take that problem-based approach. We also have to ground economics in the sciences. So first and most important, we have to ground it in the laws of physics. Simplest law of physics, you can't make something from nothing. Everything the economic system produces requires raw materials, and the only source of those raw materials is our one finite planet. You also can't do work without energy. 86% of the energy used in our economy is fossil fuels. And those fossil fuels, going back to that you can't make nothing from something, when we burn those fossil fuels, we don't lose matter or energy, but we convert it into unusable forms that are waste streams flowing back into the ecosystem that cause serious harm. Climate change, particulate matter, all these others. So just, we talk about the information economy, which supposedly frees us from the laws of physics, but making a computer has all these, uses energy, uses raw materials, and all of that goes back to nature is waste. And disordered waste that the planet has to absorb. We also have to pay attention to the laws of ecology. And we know that that raw material used to construct all economic products, it's the structural building blocks of our ecosystems. We remove that structure, we lose function, including those life-supporting functions without which we can't survive. Those ecosystem processes, they're essential to all life. So there's these unavoidable trade-offs. It's impossible to make economic products without causing ecological degradation through raw material use and energy use. So at some point, there are rising ecological costs to economic activity, diminishing economic benefits. We reach a point where continued growth makes us worse off than we are now. We have likely reached that point at a global level. We also have to focus on the nature of the challenges we face. There's a type of problem called a prisoner's dilemma, in which if everybody cooperates, it leads to the greatest good for everybody, but if any one individual doesn't cooperate, they come out ahead regardless of what others do. I show this simply in the case of climate change, the cartoon, just, you can all read that, but basically everybody can agree to cut climate emissions, knowing we'll be better off if we do, but nobody can agree to initiate it because you're always better off if the other person does it. It's well recognized that prisoners' dilemmas can only be solved through cooperation and collective action, not through competitive self-interest. That's very widely understood. An example of this, we right now live in a fossil fuel economy where I can own fossil fuels, my use of it leaves less for others, we inherently have to compete. Because I can own it, it works in a market, it feeds into a market economy. But we need to transition to a solar economy. No matter how much solar energy we in the United States capture, it doesn't leave any less for India or China or other countries. We don't need to compete. What we need to get that solar energy is knowledge, technology, information. And if we develop some great information, some great technology for capturing solar energy, and we keep it for ourselves, we put a patent on it, don't allow others to use it, we're going to get runaway climate change. If instead we share it, give it to China, give it to India, their scientists are going to prove it, give it back to us better than it was when we got it. We're moving into a new era with new problems, and we have to acknowledge that. We also have to understand mainstream economists say humans are perfectly rational and self-interested. Lots of research shows that we are the most social organism that has ever evolved. E.O. Wilson in The Social Conquest of Earth says that cooperation, that this ultra-sociality and an ability to cooperate at the scale of humans has evolved a handful of times in evolutionary history, and the animals that have achieved that now account for half the biomass of the terrestrial biomass of the planet. The most successful adaptation, arguably ever, is our capacity to cooperate. We can cooperate. So we need an economics education to apply the scientific method, bring all these ideas together. But the scientific method, we observe reality, we formulate hypotheses about how it works, and we test those against reality. So we need to continually test economic theory against reality. When our theories fail to explain an economic crisis, fail to tell us how to solve things like climate change, that is time, that's it's proof those theories are wrong. So if a theory can't help us understand reality, it's useless. And if theories are contradicted by reality, they are wrong. And there's tons of evidence that, for example, the recession of 2007 to 2008, according to mainstream theory, could not happen. Therefore, the theory must be wrong. We always have to be also guided by clear ethical goals. So ecological sustainability, this is an ethical value that future generations matter. I shouldn't use up all the resources for me today, I should care about the future. Another important issue is distributive justice. So who is entitled to what? We have the shared inheritance of wealth for nature. Who is entitled to that? How should that be distributed? We also have this issue of unearned income, which the IRS, ironically, taxes at a lower rate than earned income. If I speculate, produce nothing, make a ton of money, I'm going to be taxed at a lower rate than a hardworking individual who actually produces consumable items. Finally, efficient allocation. We have scarce resources and unmet needs, we need to allocate those efficiently, but not efficiently in terms of maximizing monetary value, efficiently in terms of, when you give food to a starving person, that creates much more value than when you give it to the overfed person. And efficiency is, satisfying needs is far more efficient than satisfying wants. So my conclusions on this fairly hasty presentation is that economics has to be based on science, not ideology, not this equilibrium system driven by a single feedback loop, but by the science, the complexity of our planet, of all the different, we use raw materials, we generate waste, we affect ecosystems, but it's got to be guided by ethical values, always guided by ethical values. An ecological economy continually evolves, and mainstream theory has barely changed in over a century. In the 1990s, when I was doing my PhD in economics, the average stock in the stock markets was held for 7 years. Now it's held for 30 seconds. And there's a whole ton of changes, equally profound, radically reforming the system. Mainstream economics in a textbook is indistinguishable from how it was taught 100 years ago. And this is just a quote from a recent economist. Says, for more than 3 decades, macroeconomics has gone backwards. We actually have worse ideas, and that's the chief economist at the World Bank. So in my last remaining seconds, just to reiterate, this transdisciplinary problem-based approach is essential. We don't have the luxury of just developing these abstract theories. We have so many serious problems we face. Society can't afford to pay this class of theoreticians who are focusing on some abstract mathematical economy that doesn't exist in the world. We need to begin applying it to what's happening in the real world. We need to solve those problems. And one of the things we understand is prisoners' dilemmas are the problems we face. They can't be solved through competitive self-interest, and it's fruitless to look in that direction. We need to develop economic institutions that promote cooperation. That is how you solve prisoners' dilemmas. And finally, I think, if I can make this, so we have to build these new economic institutions based on cooperation. And I think I pulled it off in 20 minutes. I had a great, so, a little hasty.